Hi, I'm Jason Khalipa, and welcome to the AMRAP Mentality Podcast, a show we interview interesting people about how they make the most out of every single minute. On today's episode is Amelia Boone, 4-time obstacle racing world champion, ultra runner, and also an attorney at Apple. How does she balance these different things? How does she stay relevant for so many years? And what does it take for her to know her why and her mindset so strong that when she's in the middle of a 48-hour event, she doesn't give up? I was so impressed by this conversation, and it really struck me the most when she talked about being grateful that every day she had the ability to get up early and go out and work out. She had the ability to get up every day and go run in the mountains. And she's always having this sense of gratitude, which was the overarching theme of this entire conversation. Before we dive into the episode, which I know you'll enjoy, I want to just make sure you guys know that NC Fit, our company, just released a brand new app. If you're looking for workouts, if you feel like you've been kind of stuck going to a conventional gym or any gym or on the road, we have an awesome app now for you. Go check it out in the App Store or Android Store under NC Fit. Daily videos, 6 different options every day, curated by us and the rest of our team. I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Please check out our app and also my book, As Many Reps as Possible. Without further ado, let's dive into it. You know, like we were talking about earlier, I think, Amelia, you're a super interesting, fascinating person because you really embrace this idea of kind of balancing different things in your life and succeeding at each different one. So kind of embracing this AMRAP mentality. And so I really wanted to sit down with you today and talk about, you know, what does it take from a mindset perspective to, you know, finish law school, be a attorney at arguably one of the biggest companies in the world, Apple, and I'm assuming is a very challenging job, and then also put in the work that it requires to get to where you want to be from obstacle racing and all these different crazy events you do. So I'm super fascinated. I want to thank you for coming on the show and talking with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I guess I'll first start out for people who are unfamiliar. What is the longest, how many races have you done? How many total Tough Mudders, Spartans, whatever have you done? Can you even remember? And what is the longest one you've done?
Yeah, I don't think that I can actually quantify. I'm sure someone has the numbers there.
Yeah.
It's got to be at this point probably close to 100 cumulative Spartan races, Tough Mudders, obstacle races. And then really the bread and butter, the ones that I love are the really long ones. And so I think the longest one that I've ever done is there's this race, World's Toughest Mudder, and it's 24 hours long. And so you're running 5-mile loops for 24 hours with a bunch of obstacles thrown in. And that's kind of where I did everything wrong. Like people are like, oh, we'll go out and do an obstacle race, like a 5-mile one. And I went straight to like the 24-hour one.
Yeah. Well, I think I saw that on I think it was televised, wasn't it, this time?
Yeah, they have it. Over the years, they've been progressively televising more and more of these, which is pretty cool.
So how early on did you get into, because I know you grew up in Oregon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're in school, you're becoming an attorney, you become an attorney, but when did you get into, you know, long distance runs, and what made you desire to kind of do that? Because that's not something that's very typical. I mean, I want to dive into it more, but what made you want to get into at least your first race?
Yeah, I have kind of an interesting background because I think that a lot of people get into the sport because they were collegiate runners or, you know, they were in cross country, things like that. I played team sports growing up. I played a lot of different team sports and I was pretty good, but not like the all-star. But I didn't play sports in college. I didn't play sports in law school. And I graduated law school and I started at one of the largest law firms in the world in Chicago. And I think that I kind of got there and looked around and I go, okay, now what? And I love being an attorney and I love the practice, but it was something else that I kind of was missing. And so I actually had a coworker that came in and was like, oh, there's this crazy race called a Tough Mudder. Let's do it. And I had never run 10 miles before in my life. And then it was like, okay, cool. And that's kind of when I started. I was 28 years old and I did one race. And I think just being out there and running in the hills and just, you know, crawling and climbing and just being physically exhausted.
Yeah.
It was something that was so separate and so different than my life behind a desk that I just fell in love with it.
And so this was when you were 28. So what year did you get into it?
So this was 2011.
2011.
So everything was starting. I got in on the ground floor, like right when these took off.
I was going to say that's right when these, because I think I did a Tough Mudder right around 2012. It was right around, it was when it was growing. And so you got in relatively early into the sport. And that year, I think in 2011, correct me if I'm wrong, you won the women's overall. Did you?
It was in 2012.
2012.
In 2011 I took second. There were 1,000 people that started and like 13 finishers and only 2 were women. So I technically kind of came in last for women, but I also said I came in second. But yeah, the following year I won overall, and then I took second overall actually too. So I only lost to the top male.
And that was in 2012.
12, correct.
And then did you continue to compete in the Tough Mudder every year from there on? And then how do you even qualify for that process? For those people who are unfamiliar with the way Tough Mudder works, I mean, I think most people know that you could go and sign up for a Spartan race, go and sign up for Tough Mudder. Why did you decide Tough Mudder versus other events? And then what does that process look like to get to the world championships of Tough Mudder?
Well, it's interesting because it's changed a bunch. I think back in the day, they said you had to quote unquote qualify. But the funny thing about Tough Mudders is that there was no timing at the time. The reason that I decided to do Tough Mudders and not Spartan races from the beginning was because I knew how type A personality I kind of was. And I actually didn't like the idea of being timed, ranked, and judged, which is kind of funny now that looking back over the past 8 years where I've ended up. And so I think it's like being the early beginnings of any sport. It was almost like you pay your way and you're there and you're qualified. Now, when I look at it, and I've been competing in both Tough Mudders and Spartan races, since 2011, it is actually legitimate. It's probably similar to what happened with CrossFit.
Of course,
I mean, I think that the people in the obstacle racing world have looked to CrossFit as kind of the parallel of how you build a sport. And so now it's hard. There are actual qualifications. You actually need to go and run at certain championships to be able to qualify for the world championships, and they're televised and there's prize money and all things that weren't there at the very beginning. So I lucked out being in at the ground floor. And now it's crazy how far it's come.
And so you've been able to stay pretty consistent over the years. Have you been finishing at the top of the sport for the last 8 years? I mean, I know that you got hurt,
right?
But outside of that, have you been pretty consistent at there?
Well, it was interesting because I was doing really well, and I was staying at the top. And then I ended up, I broke my femur in 2016.
Did you break it in an event?
No. It was a stress injury that ended up spiraling into a large fracture. And it knocked me out for 9 months. And I kind of had to take a step back and kind of look at everything and look at why I was doing things. And, as I sat on the sideline, the sport still grows stronger and the competitors still grow stronger. So when I came back, I wasn't dominant like I had been. But the funny thing is that in all the years that I was winning, I was kind of miserable in the back of my mind because, when you're winning, and I thought that was so important and that was my entire identity. And I hated it. And so it was almost like a blessing in disguise to have to be on the sidelines it was about
almost
18.
It
was 18 months before I actually, between races, because
you
I was sidelines, but then I had to train back into it. So
and so breaking your femur, these stress fractures then started accumulating, it just got worse and worse. So when you sidelined yourself and you're looking at these people in sport, at the time you were identifying yourself, I imagine, as this, top of the sport, ultra competitive obstacle course racer. And at the same time, you were managing to balance a career, right? And at the time, were you working at Apple?
At the time, yes, I was at Apple.
So how did you, before you got hurt, and then I want to talk about how you got hurt, how did you segment your day out? What did a typical day look like for Amelia Boone in 2012 when you win the world's toughest mudder and, and you're also a lawyer at the same time? what did your day segment out like? Can you take us through a typical day then, and then I want to fast forward?
Yeah. The funny thing is the typical day then and the typical day now is actually the same.
Yeah.
It's just I've kind of, I've shifted a bit of focus because I was living in Chicago. And so I wasn't doing as much running because it's not conducive to running as much, especially during the winter months. But yeah, I start my day the same way, and that's at around 4:00 in the morning. And I've always naturally been a morning person, and I've learned that that's when I can get uninterrupted training in, is during that time. And so I always tell people, I'm like, okay, like figure out when people aren't going to be looking for you. And for me, I knew that if I put off training until the end of the day, it may never get done.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, it's just routine for me. It's brushing my teeth. I get up and I go, I train. I'm either running or I'm lifting. I'm doing, whatever it is on deck that day. And then heading into work, 7, 8 a.m. and then working a full day and going home and going to bed early so I can get up at 4 a.m. again.
So tell me how that works. So back then and even now, it's the same thing. So you get up at 4, you avoid distractions, you're just focused on what you need to get done. And then what time do you go to bed at? On average?
I'm pretty much in bed by like 9 p.m.
Okay.
I'm
so you go
like
to bed
an 80-year-old in disguise. Yes.
That's okay. Yeah, I get it. So you go to bed early, you wake up early, and then you're attacking the day. And so, if we're in San Jose, California, we could just probably see you out on these different trails, basically getting in how many miles on a given week then and how many miles given week pretty much today or as you're ramping back up again from your injury.
Yeah, I think that so back when I was living in Chicago, it was lower mileage, but I was actually doing a lot of CrossFit as training. And that was the bulk of my training. Here now I'm averaging, because I'm doing a lot longer running, ultra marathons, things like that. And so in like full training mode, I'll probably be about 60 to 70 miles a week, with a few weeks a bit higher than that. And then I lift twice a week pretty much. And so I'm 2 to 3 times a week.
So you got this, you broke your femur, and did you learn anything from that in terms of how much compounded kind of similar motion your body could handle? And did you have to shift your training from that?
Yeah, I think what I learned a lot of things. When you ignore pain long enough to make it that bad. I think I learned to be a smarter athlete. And I also learned to realize the limitations of my ego, to learn to quiet the ego, because I've had an issue with this. And I think a lot of athletes do, is that you see other people who are doing 90, 100 miles a week. So I should be able to do that too. And I had the same issue when I was heavily into CrossFit, and I see, oh, well, that woman is, deadlifting 275. I should be pulling 275 too. And for me and my body type, that's not feasible. And so a lot of it since then, what I've learned is just, to like put the ego aside and to realize that what works for me isn't going to work for somebody else. What works for them isn't going to work for me. And to be totally into my own training and to like quiet the noise of what everyone else is doing out there.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really, really good piece of advice. I mean, I feel the same way. And I think, so as you got this injury in your sideline for a while, you kind of come to your realization that you can't worry about other people. You can't look to them. You just got to keep doing what you're doing. As you started to develop and get back onto the game, did your then results start to speak for themselves? I mean, how did that happen? So you went from being at the top to not being there at all.
Right.
To then, what was that climb like back up to get back to where you wanted to get to?
It's extremely humbling, I have to say. I think anyone who has ever been sidelined for a long time, and you start to question yourself, and you have all of this self-doubt, and when am I ready? And I wrote a lot about it, and this was really something that was very therapeutic for me, was to write, and to figure out, like, why am I feeling this way? Why am I scared? And for the biggest thing for me was actually realizing, going out the first season that I came back, and I had the worst results that I'd ever had, and realizing that the world didn't fall apart,
right,
and that I actually was happier, because I realized that, here's the thing, you can win a race and you're going to feel wonderful and glorious and get all the positive affirmation, but it's never enough because winning is never going to be enough. Like the goalpost is going to keep moving.
Right.
So you have to learn to find joy from the day to day, from the process itself, instead of just focusing on the end results. And I think that that was the big thing that I learned, is that results are great, but they're never going to fill you up at the end of the day.
That's really, really interesting. And so when you got back into the sport, you weren't performing, quote, as well, right? But you still got more fulfillment out of those accomplishments because you had kind of had this new realization. Is that?
And absolutely. Yeah. And absolutely. And as the sport grew, stronger and stronger people come into it. They're 10 years younger than me, you know? And I think that any aging athlete goes through that process where they say, all right, like I may not be the top dog anymore, but why am I here and what am I getting from this?
Yeah. And well, let me just ask you that. Like, why were you there? Why were you there in the beginning and why are you there today? Because I always kind of reflect back on like having a strong why for what we're doing, especially when it gets challenging, and whether it's the CrossFit Games, but I think about what you're doing, and you're doing these long, I mean, I'm talking 24 hours, 48-hour events, and there's a lot of demons that could come into your head and say, hey, why are you doing this? Like, Amelia, why don't you just go and like, go sit in like a jacuzzi? Like, why don't you just like,
go hang out, have a beer with friends,
yeah,
right?
go have a beer. And like, what is the deep internal why that kind of pushes you to keep wanting to sign up for these events? Because ultimately it's your decision. Like no one's making you do this. And I imagine you don't do this for the money or the fame. You do it for something inside you. So, so what is that? I mean,
I think initially when I got into it, it was just a new experience. It was a new challenge. And then it morphed into this, I kept doing it because I wanted to win. And then that made me miserable. And then having to take a step back and having to be on the sidelines and to kind of reevaluate. And now I realize like I do it, you know, because the process of it fills me up. It's constantly a challenge. And anything with a super long race, with a super long event, everything is going to go wrong. So it's very problem solving oriented, is that you kind of have to triage as you go along. And it's this big puzzle that you kind of have to figure out. And I think that that just keeps me motivated. And I, you know, if I quote unquote conquer one thing, then I want to move on to the next. And I want to constantly be finding new ways to expose myself to potential failure and to see what comes from that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And so before a race, you're at the starting line, you're probably in the middle of the woods somewhere, or you know, I did one in Lake Tahoe, so it was pretty cold, and you know, you're looking up at these mountains, you're like, okay, I'm about to go up that, right? And so you're in this serene environment, right? You have a bunch of people, and the vibes are normally pretty good at these events. Like people are generally supportive, but I imagine at the highest level, it's also extremely competitive. And so before you get into the event and when you're walking up to the finish line, or excuse me, the starting line, or even that morning of, what's going through your head? What process are you going through before the 3, 2, 1 go?
Yeah, I think for me, everyone handles it differently.
Right.
But I definitely, my nerves are the worst the night before, for sure.
Yeah.
Like the morning, I'm very kind of just automatic and going through, I'm plotting out the course in my mind. I'm kind of thinking, you know, of a game plan of when I want to push, when I want to hold back. And I'm really kind of just focusing on the logistics and quieting the kind of the spinning wheels in my head that start to question, you know, and then when you can let like negative vibes and things like that get in there. And I always keep in the back of my mind, my running coach told me one time is that your best is never enough unless it's always enough. And so I tell myself, I'm going to give my best, what I have today. And if my best isn't good enough to beat a bunch of other women out there, then that's fine. I gave my best, but I don't want to beat myself.
So the best is never good enough unless you always give your best.
Your best is never enough unless it's always enough.
Right.
Yeah.
So to summarize what he was trying to say, he was basically saying like, as long as you always leave it all out on the table, then it's always going to be okay.
Yeah.
And so has there been a time in your life when you've gone to one of these events and, you know, I've had these moments myself, which is why I want to ask you, have you ever finished a race and let's just say you finished 5th and you said to yourself, man, I don't know if I did everything I could to put myself in a position to take 3rd. Maybe I wouldn't have won, but maybe I could have gotten 3rd if I had done this. And you kind of beat yourself up around that? Or have you always kind of gone into it with your coach's mentality that you're always doing your best, and so your best is going to be okay?
I definitely have questioned myself, because there are times when I've made silly mistakes where I've beaten myself, and I've always said, I don't mind finishing last as long as I, didn't beat myself. And so there have been times where, I've let the ball drop, or I've made mistakes, things like that. And yeah, I'll go look back on those and reflect on them. But I think what I've learned over the years is to not get in that vicious cycle of self-flagellation over those mistakes, and just be like, okay, I screwed up here, but that's fine. It's something to work on, move on.
Yeah. And so do you do, after the event is done, and then I want to talk about during the event, but after the event is complete, do you do like a post-mortem? Do you evaluate your performance and either write it down, what you need to do differently, evaluate what you could have done differently leading up into it, anything like that from a training perspective?
I generally kind of let it simmer for a few days, and just try to enjoy finishing, I just try to enjoy the fact that I went out there and I did something really hard.
You put yourself on the line.
Yeah, I did something really hard. And I think that I tend to have a problem where I intellectualize too much. And so sometimes I just need to let it be. But then in the few days following, and especially a big event, I'll write about it and try and figure out, I'm like, okay, like, how was I feeling going into it? What could I have done differently? And what was just beyond my control?
Yeah.
Because with a lot of these really long races, the longer a race gets for me, the more things that go awry that are outside of your control. You can't control
the
when
weather,
you start vomiting 8 hours into a race, like, and your stomach is just rebelling. But that's part of the fun, I think.
Well, and so on that note, I want to talk about how these experiences translate into your real life, like outside of the sport. But before we get there, I want to talk about during the event. And that event could be, what's the shortest event you really compete in?
I'll do like a short course Spartan sprint. So it's like 4 or 5 miles. So it's, 45 minutes or so.
Right. It's not too long. So you go from 45 minutes to, I think, 2 or 3 days?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a long way to go. And so, I think staying in the game for 45 minutes, I think most people listening could conceptualize in their head how they could have a strong enough desire to complete this task that they could stay in the game for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, maybe even 5 or 6 hours. But when you're starting to talk about multiple days in a row, can you take me through what that process looks like on a 24-hour race? Like, what are the ups and downs from a competitor's perspective? Because I've done go rucks and stuff that are long, but I've never done like a 48-hour event. What does that process look like mentally? And then on top of that, you're not just doing it like to accomplish, you're doing it to win. Mm-hmm. So what other added pressure is that? Because I imagine there's a big difference between just finishing and finishing with the expectation that you want to do the best you can.
Yeah. I think that everyone kind of, it's really just repetition, because the first time that you do an event that long, you have no idea what's going to happen.
No.
And I always tell people when they're tackling something that long is that break it up into chunks. If you look at your watch and you're like, 30 minutes down, I got 23 and a half hours to go. Like, you're done. You are donezo. So the thing is like, don't focus on that. Focus on just, the next little task at hand, the next little loop, the next little obstacle, getting to the next aid station, and really not looking at the big picture.
So is that what you do? So from the beginning of your race, you'll maybe create micro goals. Mm-hmm. So the macro goal is to finish this in a place, whatever, right? Then you establish micro goals along the way that you try and kind of like give yourself moderate wins as you go. Mm-hmm. Is that your technique?
Absolutely. And I think that everyone is you're going to go through highs and lows. And so I actually hit a low pretty early on. I've learned that, I'll hit a low a few hours into a race. But then if I get through that, like there have been times where I'm 3 hours into something, I'm like, I want to quit. I'm done. But then I realize that like 45 minutes later, I'm going to feel great. And so it's really simple. It's one foot in front of the other, and not listening to that nagging little voice, unless there's something catastrophically wrong, injury or whatnot. But
well, so you talk about getting, a couple hours in and then having this negative voice come out. Have you ever stopped a race?
I have DNF'd one race, and it was because I got frostbite on my feet. So
What? Frostbite? I've never met anybody in my life who's got frostbite.
I was in a river in Vermont in the middle of winter. So this race that we used to do called the Death Race. And it's,
of course,
you don't know that here's an added twist. You don't actually know when it finishes. And so you go into this race and you keep going until they tell you, like, okay, you're done, but you don't mentally know when you're going to be done. So it could be 32 hours in. One time we went 72 hours. And so, yeah,
so how did you know you had frostbite?
Well, it's pretty apparent after a while.
I don't know anything about wow. And so, okay, so then you basically were medically, I guess.
Yeah, I called it because I was like, you know what, my toes are too important for this.
Yeah.
So,
and so looking back on that particular experience, I mean, I think most people listening would have absolutely done the same thing, and they probably wouldn't even have signed up in the first place. I mean, just doing a 30-hour race sounds terrible to me, but not knowing how long it's going to be sounds even worse. I mean, so now after that experience, did that really affect you one way or another, or not really?
I think that the first time that you go into something and you don't finish it, like when you get a big DNF, like it is very gutting. You know, it's people talk about like death over DNF, but I actually think that it's, you know, there are very smart reasons to like pull the plug on something, sometimes frostbite being one, or, you know, risking really bad injury. And I don't think there's any shame in it, but it is definitely a very like a hard mental thing, you know, to kind of grapple with for sure.
And so out of your 100+ races, whatever that you DNF'd, you were medically, like you didn't feel safe moving forward only once.
Well, and then when I ran the Berkeley Marathons this past year and I finished 1 loop, 2 loops that counted. But yeah, so that was technically a DNF, but I mean, everyone DNF'd that race. So.
Yeah. So I want to talk about that race. And so I want to get into the Berkeley race because that's a really fascinating thing. But before we dive into that, I want to see, how have you seen, you know, your ability to wake up every day at 4 a.m., your ability to get on the road, do this grinding, and you're within your own head. What positives have you seen transfer into your relationships, into your job? I mean, do you feel like you training for a race makes you a better human being?
Absolutely. I think that there's I've thought a lot about this because people ask, they're like, how is there a parallel between being an attorney and these races and whatnot? And I think a lot of it is a lot of discipline. But I absolutely think that when you put yourself in really uncomfortable positions, you kind of realize in your day-to-day life, like how fortunate we are, and also like how capable we are.
Yeah.
I always joked, like, I think pulling an all-nighter at work when I was at a law firm was way harder than running for 24 hours, you know, like it's, but like it is that kind of that, just like that mental grit that you develop. And I think anything people ask, like, how can I be more tough, or how can I, you know, get through this? And I'm like, it's a muscle, and you just have to keep using it over and over and over again.
I love that. And so it's a muscle, and you have to keep using it, but you also need to kind of grow it over time, in my opinion. So would you recommend for anybody who's looking to use fitness to grow this grit, this hustle, this hard work mentality that you use every day in your life, do you start off with just a 1 mile run? Then do you sign up for a 10K? I mean, then do you overtime? Because like, how long did it take you to go from doing your first Tough Mudder and then transitioning to these longer events? Did it take a while? I mean, well, I guess you did pretty quickly.
I did it the wrong way. I did one Tough Mudder, and then I was like, oh, here's a 24-hour one. Let's sign up.
And so, you know, would the recommendation be for someone who's listening, who's like, okay, Amelia Boone is my hero. She's out there grinding it, but she also has this, you know, corporate job. What would you recommend? A 10K on the street, or would you recommend a hill run?
I think the thing is to figure out what sparks your passion.
Yeah.
Because I've never run a road marathon. I've never run a road race. I've never even run a road 5K. It doesn't appeal to me because I wouldn't want to wake up every day and like run on the road. That doesn't speak to me. But being out on the trails and the mountains does. So I think the person needs to look at like, okay, what appeals to me? It doesn't have to be running it. You know, it could be within the CrossFit realm. And then, you know, just start making it a habit and make it non-negotiable. And so that's the thing where it's like, it is every single day, and the more that you do it, the more it becomes ingrained. Like, I can't picture not getting up in the morning and going straight to training. And even on like, I take one full rest day a week, and it's really, really hard for me, but I still have that routine in the morning where I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to go work out, but I am going to do like mobility and stretching and things like that, just so it keeps that rhythm.
But you didn't play sports in college. So so when you were in college and you weren't playing sports, did you still try and wake up early and grind it out? Or was that something you found after college?
No, I was like grinding. In college, I sang, I was in a cappella groups. I had a different kind of grinding it out.
One day I need to come hear I need to hear your skills.
Oh man, thank God that was before like the
internet.
Social media and the internet. Yeah. But yeah, no, not before the internet.
Yeah, but before the social media really took off.
Yeah. So yeah. I always super disciplined, from a very early age, I think, and almost to a fault. I think my parents were always like, it's okay to not be in your routine, Amelia.
And so you internally are just, a very disciplined, hardworking person. So this translates really well into your life.
Right.
But do you ever have these moments where, like, for example, you talk about getting comfortable with uncomfortable. I've been doing that a lot lately with cold water.
Yeah.
So I've been doing a lot of ice baths.
Yep.
I've been doing a lot of, those kind of things. And it's really uncomfortable for me. That's hard for me. Mm-hmm. I don't like being cold.
Right.
But I feel better when I accomplish it. Are there days that you wake up and you're like, damn, it's 4 a.m. Boy, my pillow just seems so cozy. I mean, it can't be every day that you're just fired up to go.
Well, so interestingly enough, I don't really struggle with motivation for that because, well, I have in the past, but when you are, I think injuries and things like that when you get sidelined, you start to realize how much you've taken just being active for granted when you can't do it.
Right.
And so I still hold that. And I'm like, okay, Amelia, you had an entire year where all you could do was swim with a pool buoy between your legs. Like, be thankful that you can go out there and move your body up a mountain. And so I wake up every day like overjoyed to be able to do it.
That's really interesting perspective because I've never heard it spoken that way, right? I mean, I think you wake up in the morning and normally you just tell yourself, like for me, it's like, hey, get up, go do this. Don't even think about it. Just walk out into the garage and start or whatever. Mm-hmm. I mean, each person might have their own different thing, but you actually reframe it in your head to be something of gratitude, be something of appreciation that I have this body that can accomplish this task. Mm-hmm. I need to go basically, pay its dues or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really an interesting way to look at it. So, as an attorney, back to your training methodology. So, from a nutrition perspective, is there things you've learned about your body that just work better than other things?
I always tell people I'm the last person that should give nutrition advice because I eat Pop-Tarts before races. And people are like, what?
Yeah.
But
does that carbohydrates, does that sugar, that glycogen?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's
it sits well. It sits easy on the stomach. It breaks down easily. And so, but I always say like, don't look to me for nutrition advice.
Well, because nutrition during a race day, I imagine you have to accumulate quite a bit of carbohydrates to keep the body flowing. And it's hard to pack down a lot of fat and protein when you're in the middle of a race. Like you're not really going to eat a burger. I imagine that's tough.
No, I've learned the hard way, actually. The first 100K I ever ran, I came to this aid station and they have these like bacon cheese quesadillas for people. So aid stations during ultras are fantastic. But I was like, oh, that looks so good. And then I ate one and then I took off running. And then, half an hour later, it came all back up because your body does not want that when it's running. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of disgusting the amount of sugar that we eat because it just sits well on the stomach. But people have trained their bodies to be able to fuel with fat. I've learned it. It's harder for women in general, and it doesn't really work for me.
So talking about your next step,
you
were sidelined with the femur break, you came back, and then you broke your ankle or your foot? Your foot.
Yeah. I mean, look, I've been injured 40 million times. It's part and parcel of what I do. Yeah.
But now you're just getting back into training, and you competed how long ago at this Berkeley event?
That was last April.
So I want to talk about this Berkeley event because I think it's super fascinating how you're choosing to put yourself in a position where no one wins, basically. No one's ever won. Is that what happens?
So this event, I'll give a kind of a brief. The Berkeley Marathons, people have probably seen it on through a documentary on Netflix. But it's been running for about 35 years now. And I think at this point, there have been 15 people who have finished over those 35 years and about 42 runners a year. It's very small.
15 total people.
15 total, yeah.
So technically
most years there are no finishers. And
most years there's only one person who ever finished. Has there ever been more than one?
There, 1 year, 3 people finished, but that was like an anomaly.
Right.
Most years, last year when I ran, there were 0 finishers. But yeah, it's 5 loops in the mountains in eastern Tennessee, and it's 20 to 25 mile loops. And it's about 15,000 feet of elevation gain per loop, but you don't really know because there's no course map. You basically use a map and a compass to navigate through it. But it's by far the scariest thing that I've ever, because when you go into a race and you're like, this race has a 99.9999% failure rate. And you have a bunch of type A people who are not used to failing at something. And so it's a it's a weird mindset to put yourself in. And having DNF'd it last year, I did 1 loop and then we did 2 loops, but then we were timed out, cause you have to do it under a certain time.
Oh, okay.
The funny thing is I was like, man, I just DNF'd a race, but I am so proud of that for even
attempting it, right?
For even attempting it. Cause I realized for me, the success was giving myself the opportunity to attempt it.
And so this race, you basically use, you just find books on the trail? Is that what?
Yeah, to be able to show that you were on course, there are books hidden out among the woods. Yeah. And so you have to rip pages out of them and then bring them back that show that you're out on the course.
What? And you want to do it again?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely, because it's something that for me, I've realized that the finishing, the winning doesn't matter. It's the process of being out there and just, giving it my all and finding new ways to fail. I think people are so scared of failure and and I was for so long, and there's nothing to be scared of with it.
I mean, listening to you talk and just knowing you for a while now, I mean, you're, like I said, a very inspiring person for a number of reasons. But when I listen to you talk there's been some adversity with injuries you had to overcome. You had to rethink your why and what you're doing and part of the process. But can you even back us up into a time when you just weren't as mentally, have you always just, because I'm finding it hard to believe that, was there just some spark in you one day? I mean, because I know you said your parents were a little bit more laid back. So I'm just trying to find out, for someone who's listening and they feel like you're unreachable because of your mindset, 4 a.m. every day, grinding it out on the trails, and you're talking about doing all these uncomfortable things that are extremely uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about, trying to ice bath once a month. You're talking about going out for 100-miler and then all the training that required to get there. When have you had a time when all of this has just broken down?
It has a lot. I mean, I think that it's never going to be a perfect fit. And, what I say to people when I say, I may have the athletics and I may have the career, but there are a lot of things that I let fall by the wayside. Awful cook, my generally not very clean. My apartment's generally a mess, and and I still, there are pieces of me that I let slide to be able to pursue the passions. And I think that no one can quote unquote have it all. You just kind of pick and choose what your all is at that moment. Yeah. And that's really what I say, because I do the same thing. I look at people and I go, man, I wish that I could do X, Y, and Z and they have it all figured out. And I'm sure they don't. None of us do. We're all stumbling through this together, And so I think that that's really important to realize that when you are super successful, maybe in 1 or 2 things, there are going to be a lot of other things that you're not successful in.
Yeah. I mean, you've decided to prioritize these certain things in your life. And so do you feel like by prioritizing these runs and all those gifts it has given you, has that held you back at all in your career?
I don't believe so. I think that I've never been one, and this was important when I started as an attorney at a law firm, and I realized the next step is to be a partner.
Right.
And I looked at that and I go, that's actually really not what I want. It's great for some people. But I was like, I like my work. I like to do it, but I also like to do other things outside of it. And so I've never really like climbing the corporate ladder isn't a huge, like draw to me. I love the work and I love the discipline of being an attorney. I love the mental part of it. But I also like want to kind of keep it well-rounded. So maybe, yeah. So I'm not going to be, the top, I'm not going to be on the Supreme Court,
right.
But I don't want to do that.
Right. It seems like you're pretty in tune with what you want and how to accommodate what you're looking for. And then, on that last facet that I normally talk about is on the relationship side. Have you found the time you've dedicated to these hours of training have impacted maybe your friends and going out with them, or maybe they don't align with that lifestyle? Like, no. I mean, that's tough there's very few people that are as dedicated to anything like you are. Have you found that holding you back at all?
I think that definitely the relationships part, is difficult. And I think that you start to become friends with other people that have the similar, a lot of my friends are athletes doing this as well, because, we all understand that we're going to bed at 8 p.m. at night to get up for our early morning runs. So we're like, okay, brunch works,
It's so funny. My wife and I, we were debating about next year. I think we're going to celebrate East Coast New Year's instead of like California, so it's 3 hours.
I can't remember the last time I was up for New Year's, to be honest.
Yeah, because it's been and so, I mean, I think you're a really good testament of someone who's balancing different things in their life, but also recognizing where you want to prioritize and what you want to do. And maybe you'll reevaluate in a year, a couple of years from now. But right now, what's the main focus for Amelia Boone? What is the next big race? The Berkeley one?
Berkeley, marathons.
That's the big one.
I mean, there's several things on the horizon, and that I'm looking towards. I'm still actually building out my calendar right now. But I have a 200 miler this summer. So that will be several days through Washington, running 200 miles.
Do you get to sleep?
They have, at that one, they do have cots along the aid stations where people will nap, for, 15, 20 minutes at a time as you're going. But I actually find it's generally better if you don't sleep. Because your body starts, if you sit down, you're just not going to keep going. So, I don't know.
So, I mean, look, I could sit here and talk to you about these different races for days, and I want to follow up, and I want to follow up with you and see how this Berkeley race goes and this 200 miler. But I think you've really shined light on some really cool mindset things that you've had to integrate. If there was one tip for someone who wanted to optimize their life in whatever way, like from a mindset perspective, from a physical perspective, at work, what's something they could do, in your opinion, that's something you integrate that really helps you to kind of be the best version of yourself?
Yeah, I mean, really for me, it always comes back to gratitude. And every little thing, when I question my why, when I question why I'm doing something, why am I up at 4 a.m., when I'm looking at everything, I'm always coming back to a place of how fortunate I am and what my gifts are and my ability to use them. And I think it's such an underutilized, it's such an underutilized muscle of people to be like, to kind of flip everything and no, I don't have to do this. I get to do this, because nothing that I'm doing, running 200 miles, isn't something that I have to do. I get to do it. And so I think really just reframing that is really important in anything that you do.
Yeah. I mean, basically you're taking entitlement and you're reshifting it. Like you're basically anti being entitled, expecting life to do whatever, no one owes you anything. You have to go out there and be grateful for what you have and get out there and earn it for yourself. Gratitude. Well, Amelia, for those people who want to know more about you, who want to follow your journey, where could they find out more information about you?
Yeah, so I'm all over the interwebs, as everyone is nowadays. I'm on Instagram, ARBoone11, Twitter at Amelia Boone. Then I have a website that's rarely updated, but it's there. It's AmeliaBooneRacing.com.
Perfect. Well, guys, I hope you have a great day. And Amelia, I really want to thank you for coming on the show. I've said this like 4 times, but I'm just so fascinated. I can't wait to watch you kind of propel up and accomplish your next goals.
Thank you.
All right, guys, don't forget to please rate, review, share with your friends, and screenshot it and direct message us. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Have a great day, everybody.